The penultimate verse of John, uh, the penultimate verse of John tells us, "This is the disciple who testifies of these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true." The truth of the gospel accounts is fundamental to the Christian faith. It's necessary for each of us to evaluate the evidence they provide carefully to determine the truth of Christianity. Sometimes the hardest part of evaluating evidence is figuring out how to evaluate the evidence fairly, to avoid bringing our own biases to the evidence instead of letting the evidence speak to us. Today, we're going to take a look at an approach for investigating the truth of the gospel accounts. Before we get started, follow us to hear about our upcoming live streams and everything else we're working on. You can like us on Facebook or you can subscribe on YouTube. And if you'd like to be notified of our upcoming streams and videos, you can click the notification bell. We'd really appreciate it. I'm Ryan Hebert for Meet Jesus. Thank you for joining us. If you're joining us live, please ask your questions in the chat box. And if you're coming later, leave your questions in the comment section below. Joining us today is Dr. Lydia McGrew. Dr. McGrew is an analytic philosopher, homemaker, homeschooling mom, and author. She is the author of The Mirror or the Mask, Liberating the Gospels from Literary Devices, and Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. You can find her on Facebook, YouTube, and at her website, lydiamcgrew.com. Links are in the description. Thank you for joining us, Lydia.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
So in your book, Mirror the Mask, you're laying out a few things. One of those things is the reportage model of the gospel. And this is a model to help us understand what the gospels are purporting to be, what we should see them as, right?
Right.
What is this model?
So I try to keep it pretty simple, and in simple terms, the reportage model is the view that the gospel authors were trying to get it right in a literal historical sense, and that they were highly successful. So they were close enough to the facts that they were able to be highly successful at telling us accurately what happened in the life of Jesus. So that's like that. That's the elevator version of the reportage model.
Okay, that makes sense. The model seems intuitive, and maybe the question that most of us would come up with is whether they were accurate or not. Maybe the question is the first part. Sometime, are they really trying to? What other models are there than this reportage model?
So I would distinguish, roughly speaking, three other models, and these don't all remain sharply distinct from one another. They kind of tend to meld into each other, but very roughly speaking. So the first I would just boldly call the liberal model. And the liberal model of the Gospels is that they're very inaccurate. Either they contain a lot of mistakes, or they're not really trying to do history much at all. This would be Bart Ehrman's approach, Bishop Spong, a lot of mainstream biblical scholars would take this approach, that either they're just kind of fictionalizing all over the place, or else they're just making a lot of errors. And you'll find one of the ways in which these models don't remain sharply distinct is that some scholars will take that model, what I would call that very liberal model, toward the Gospel of John, but then take one of the less liberal models toward Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So you'll find people making that distinction. Then the second one I would call the literary device model. And I still think of this as somewhat quote unquote liberal, if we're going to use that categorization. And it varies even among people who accept it. They don't all agree about the extent of these so-called literary devices. So that's where this lies, sort of on a continuum. But the literary device model would say that there is quite a bit of history in the Gospels, quite a lot of history in the Gospels, but that the authors frequently felt that they were licensed to change certain facts. Sometimes they'll say details, but the actual specifics will sometimes actually involve whole incidents or whole discourses or sayings that didn't occur recognizably at all, which I think most people would not call mere details. And then sometimes it's a lot of details. And again, scholars might take this model to a further extent with the Gospel of John than they would with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Then the third model, roughly speaking, I call it the smorgasbord model. So I get a smorgasbord. My goodness, after COVID, nobody's going to know what a smorgasbord is. But anyway, a smorgasbord is like a buffet where you go and you take a little bit of this and a little bit of that, like a buffet restaurant or a buffet style meal. And so in the smorgasbord model, you attempt to take a lot of the Gospels as historical, maybe most of them as historical. But then if the scholar is unsatisfied in certain cases, then he'll go to the literary device model and say, oh, the authors they thought they were allowed by the standard of their time to change this fact. And that accounts for this sort of stubborn case where I'm having trouble accounting for it. So then that person views himself as only reaching for that occasionally. So I think that makes a pretty good layout of alternative models of the Gospels.
Okay, that makes sense. It seems like if whatever principles we take to interpret, we want to apply them consistently. So how do we apply these different ideas consistently? How do we evaluate whether it's correct or not? Like, how do we identify that reportage model or a different one is the better view to take, or the default? What should be the default?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And that issue of consistency is, I think you could see right away, especially relevant to that smorgasbord model.
Right.
And to I would say the literary device model as well. I just think it becomes more acute with the smorgasbord model because the person is sort of making this unprincipled exception when he's unhappy with something he's saying, oh, I'm going to say they changed that. So I think we have to try to get a view of the author and what the author is trying to do. And it helps, if we have more than one book. The book of Acts is really helpful here for Luke, for example. It helps if we have statements from the author himself about what he was trying to do. So we find, for example, you quoted that at the beginning from the end of John. His record is true, and similarly in a chapter 2 earlier, 1935, he says, the one who has seen this has borne record, and his record is true. That's the beloved disciple at the cross of Jesus. So sometimes they're telling us what they're trying to do. And I think that really strongly supports the reportage model, because what people who take the other models have to do is to say that they're either, I would say that the very liberal scholar might say they're just lying, they're just propagandists. They're going to say it's true, but, they don't, that's just part of their self-presentation, But then the literary device and smorgasbord person, they have to say, well, put sort of an asterisk by the word true there, right? True doesn't, quite mean true. So even when Peter in one of the Petrine epistles says, we've not followed cleverly designed tales or fables, and Peter was Mark's source for the Gospel of Mark, we're told by the church fathers. So those kinds of external statements are helpful. And then also just examining, as we'll be doing further in this video, how right they get it. Do they seem to in fact be getting it right? Do they seem to in fact be getting it wrong? That kind of evidence is going to help us to determine a correct model. But I would say a couple of these have a lot of trouble with the issue of consistency. And I think it's worth pressing that question: what principled reason does this person have? I sometimes say to people who take the reportage model, and try to set it aside, and then they want to maybe take a smorgasbord approach. You don't have a signed statement from Matthew or Mark or Luke or John that says, I only change the facts this many times and no more times than would make Dr. So-and-so uncomfortable. You know,
Right.
it's like I'm talking to Dr. So-and-so, and I'm like, you're only adopting this enough that it doesn't make you uncomfortable, but you don't have any promise from these guys once you say that it was allowed at the standards of their time that they're only going to do it as many times as you're going to be comfortable with. So that's how I try to push that consistency issue.
Yeah, so it seems like there's two kind of pivotal questions. One is, what are they trying to say? What are they actually
Hmm.
saying? And then the other is, did they get it right?
Right. Hmm.
Uh, so do we need to assume that they did get it right, or do we need to assume that the Bible is even inerrant to accept the reportage model?
No, absolutely not. The reportage model is I would call it a non-deductive conclusion. So we're going at it uh, like an explanatory inference that I would talk about as a philosopher, inference to the best explanation. We're saying, what does this look like when we look at the evidence? So you don't come in there like assuming anything. Moreover, while you can be an inerrantist, in fact, I would say inerrancy and the reportage model are very friendly to one another. I mean, all real inerrantists accept the reportage model, but not all people who accept the reportage model accept inerrancy. So it's like a one-way, implication. But you you go in there and you try to see what conclusion you come to. So you might come to the conclusion that they were always trying to get it right, and that then they occasionally made some minor factual error that they made in good faith. It was like an accident, but they're still highly reliable because it's just the nature of human beings. Even if they're really good at something, they're not absolutely infallible, but that still consistent, just like it would be with a friend or someone you might know, someone you might trust, still consistent with having a really high expectation that they're going to get something right, but it's just not absolute. um, or you could find that you're never drawing that conclusion. Like what you're finding could, for all you know, inductively be compatible with inerrancy. And so I found that what I call old-fashioned inerrantists are very friendly to the work I'm doing, where an incompatibility comes in with my work is with what I call neo-inerrancy. Neo-inerrancy is redefining inerrancy, where the author could be changing something. It's like, oh, it didn't really happen then, but he made it look like it happened then, and then they'll say that's not an error. And so that's not old-fashioned inerrancy. And so the old-fashioned inerrantist and I are both on sort of one side and disagreeing with that redefinition of inerrancy over there on the other side.
So how does this reportage model deal with speech? Yeah, I can't remember what I said yesterday. Uh, does the reportage model require them to remember verbatim what Jesus said, or are they reported word for word, or are they paraphrased, or what?
Yeah, excellent question. Some of us have better memories than others for speech. I happen to think that uh, the Apostle John, in particular, had a really good auditory memory, a hearing memory, but it's not going to be verbatim. And so the reportage model has nuance in it. It's not rigid. Um, it does allow for paraphrase because that's normal in reportage. So if you're talking to a friend and he tells you what somebody else says, and he says he said that, blah 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 blah, it's not going to be word for word, but it can still be quite accurate. So the way I put it is that the reportage model is seeking recognizable paraphrase. So let's suppose you were there and you spoke Aramaic or Greek, whatever Jesus happened to be speaking, and you understood it, and you're in the crowd, and you're hearing it. You would say, "Oh man, this is the Sermon on the Mount." It would be recognizable. Or this is that dialogue where he says, "Before Abraham was, I am." Oh, look, they're picking up the stones, to stone him. So that these would be recognizable speeches. And so then that's going to allow for paraphrase. So when we find these trivial differences, like Matthew reports that God the Father says, "This is my beloved Son from heaven," and Mark reports that he said, "You are my beloved Son from heaven." I mean, that's nothing. That's how two different completely honest witnesses could just remember it very slightly differently, and that's completely consistent with the reportage model.
Thank you. I like that you brought up the place where he says, "Before Abraham was, I am." So this is one that some people are looking at very closely with extra scrutiny. And if he didn't say those exact words, then maybe we wouldn't be so confident of them. But if we can have some flexibility, maybe that's a problem too. But we would expect that an eyewitness there, he might not remember the exact words, but he knew enough of the exact words to communicate exactly what was said, exactly what was meant. Does that sound right to you?
It does. Now, with a short saying like that, it's interesting you brought that up. There's a blogger named Steve Hayes who passed away last year. He was just quite a warrior for the faith. And he made a good point at one point. He said, now, when we're talking about short phrases, we have to be careful about the notion of paraphrase, because the more you change a short phrase, then it can cease to be recognizable pretty quickly.
Right.
And so, especially when he uses I am, that's the way that he's like alluding to Exodus 3, where God says to Moses, tell the people that I am has sent you. So I think we need that, but probably the easiest way to see the possibility of paraphrase there is that he might have said something longer. And it's funny because when people call the at John 8:58 into question, they very seldom, and they say, "Oh, well, it may have been a paraphrase," and they're using that word paraphrase in this kind of, I would say, misleading way. They very seldom mean something like this. And Jesus really said, before Abraham was in Canaan living, I am, for I am eternally with the Father, blah, blah, blah. Like he went out and said like way more than what John records. And then John remembered, before Abraham was, I am. And it's like, you could call that a paraphrase because it's shortening it, right? And yet it's still got all the really explosive high Christology. If anything, the historical thing had more in that imaginary scenario. So I think with a very short saying like that, we're probably going to be imagining him having something quite close to it in his original language, so that you could recognize it, because it's that sort of boiled down saying that is causing all of the fuss, if I could put it that way. But sometimes you'll get a statement. Unfortunately, Craig Evans has done this, where he'll say that John paraphrased in that place, and it comes out that what he means is that Jesus didn't say anything. He didn't say that recognizably at all. Instead, he claimed in other ways to be God. And Dr. Michael Licona has semi-endorsed this view as well. He said if you put a gun to his head, it's what he would believe, that Jesus claimed the prerogatives of deity, claimed to be God, implied that he was God in other ways, in other scenes, and then John kind of creatively wrote this scene that didn't really recognizably occur, and they'll call that paraphrase. And it's like, no, that's not a paraphrase. That's a creation. That's an invention. It's not what would normally be called paraphrase. So that's where we want to be careful with that word. But I can certainly imagine that Jesus might have said something a little bit different there that would still be quite recognizable as that very explosive statement, before Abraham was, I am.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. It seems like there's a measure of what people can maybe pejoratively say, but there's a measure of common sense to it. We can understand that if we change the wording too much, it's not an accurate report. But there are some minor variations that are acceptable. And especially with something short like this, the meaning would have to be clearly communicated in both correctly.
And
So,
in that historical context,
and in
right? Like
that,
he's
right.
standing there in Jerusalem and so forth. Yeah.
Well, all right. So, what about the order of events? Sometimes the gospel writers don't seem to be putting things in the same order. Is that something the reportage model can be okay with, or is that a problem?
Yeah, it's a good question that's come up because again, this will be sort of used as a straw man against the reportage model. Like, oh, you think that everything has to be recorded exactly in order. So what I do in the mirror or the mask and in my videos and stuff, I distinguish two different things. I call them achronology and dyschronology. So achronology, that A letter means not. So this would be a case where the author's not intending to communicate a chronology. So for example, in the Temptations in the Wilderness, Luke records them in a slightly different order than Matthew. But Luke just uses the word and. It's this, just this word and this and that. So he's not, I think we can infer that Luke is not intending to communicate the chronological order that it happened. And that's an inference. Sometimes somebody can be implying an order deliberately, and we have to just be, again, commonsensical and try to infer. But especially when they're not being at all explicit, then that should be a very open possibility that the author is not trying to communicate the order that it happened. Dyschronology, on the other hand, is when the author is intending to communicate an order that he knows isn't correct. So, for example, if John moved Jesus' temple cleansing deliberately to the beginning of his ministry, then that would be dyschronology because he'd be saying, I know it didn't happen then, but kind of in my story, I'm going to make it happen then. And that is incompatible with the reportage model because that's not trying to get it right. Like I said, reportage model, they're trying to get it right. But achronology is definitely compatible. Now, does that solve all the chronological problems that we could ask about the Gospels? No, it doesn't. There are going to be some where I'm still going to say, it really does look like they both are stating or implying a chronology and they appear to be incompatible. I don't know how to reconcile that. And that's, part of why I'm not an inerrantist. And an old-fashioned inerrantist would probably, in that case, just say, well, there's probably just, something we don't know. And that's what the inerrantists used to do. They always used to do if they weren't satisfied with a given harmonization. But it does mean that the reportage model is definitely compatible with reporting in a different order, reporting topically or something like that, achronologically.
Do you have an example of that, where you're not sure of what a good solution would be?
Yeah, here would be an example that it gets brought up a lot by the literary device theorists, the cursing of the fig tree. So in Mark, Jesus is going to Jerusalem on the morning after the triumphal entry. So it would be Monday, it looks like. Mark doesn't use the word Monday, but
Right.
we're doing it day by day, so we infer it's Monday. And that triumphal entry is on Sunday, and then it's the next day, and he's going and he sees this fig tree, and it doesn't have any figs, and he curses it. And then they continue, and then he goes to the temple. He cleanses the temple that day. And he goes back to Bethany. He's kind of treating Bethany like the hotel. You go back out of the city right at night and possibly staying with Mary and Martha. And so then the next day he comes back into the city and they find the fig tree withered. And the disciples are astonished and they say, look, this fig tree is completely withered. And then he gives them a little discussion of faith and so forth. So that's how it goes in Mark. And then in Matthew, Matthew narrates the cleansing of the temple on the same, like it looks like the same visit to the temple as triumphal entry. Well, you could call that a chronology. Like that might be susceptible to just saying he's just kind of jumping ahead and just saying something else that happened in the temple and not really trying to imply that they were on the same day. But then the problem is that it looks like it's, the next day that Jesus curses the fig tree. Well, then that would be like a day earlier. You see what I'm saying? By narrating the cleansing of the temple, and then the next day, the cursing of the fig tree in Mark, he cleanses the temple after he goes in, after he cursed the fig tree. Then, to make it harder, Matthew says, and immediately the fig tree withered. and then they have this conversation about faith and so forth, and you're like, because he's got that word immediately in there. So you can try these various things like, well, it immediately began to wither and so forth, but they're then they're having this conversation about faith, which in Mark they're having the next day. So it really, when they find it completely withered, so it really does look like a somewhat different chronology. And of course, Matthew would have actually been there. Mark would have been getting it from Peter. And you know how these things are. I mean, this is pretty detailed stuff. And even if it's even 10 years later, I mean, it's probably somewhat longer. That's still a really early date for Matthew and Mark. But if it's even 10 years later, you can imagine that Matthew might have remembered the order a little bit differently from Mark and just be kind of stating it out there for what it's worth. This is how I remember the order in which it happened. And that's in some tension with traditional inerrancy.
And so maybe the question needs to be, does that provide significant evidence that this account is not true, or that they changed it or something like that?
Right. Well, see, and then I would not be saying that that's a deliberate change at all, right? You'll notice what I just brought up. I brought up the fallibility of memory after a certain period of time. So then that's not, and this is the problem. The literary device theorists will look at that. Dr. Lacona looks at that and he says, oh, see, so Matthew changed it. Why do we need to think that? The funny thing is, if you're saying Matthew changed it, you're already not an inerrantist. I'm sorry, but there's no reason to try to hang on to inerrancy at that point. So you might as well at that point consider that he didn't deliberately change anything. He just remembered it differently. Because that's like a more normal thing that we find. It's a simpler explanation because it's more common. It's more commonsensical in our daily lives that people just remember things a little bit differently. Why not go for that instead? Now, it's a good question though. Okay, but even so, how does that affect reliability? And I think what we have to do is go very empirically here. If you did conclude that either Matthew or Peter, as Mark's source, remembered the order there incorrectly a little bit by a day or something, how does it affect reliability? Well, how would that affect reliability with a friend or a witness on the witness stand or a modern historian? Think of these different. If you're a policeman, somebody you're interrogating, and I would say not very much, because we kind of allow for that already. Not that we say it's okay for them to change it, not that kind of allowing for it, but in our estimates, our inductive estimate of how often somebody's going to get something right and wrong, we know that a person who's very close to the events, who's very reliable, is nonetheless fallible. And so we can have a model that still is very defensible and is very consistent and is very principled, that nonetheless has only a small amount of good faith fallibility sort of built into it, because that's a kind of person that we do encounter. Especially, of course, then we need more data, right? Especially when we get more data showing, yeah, but this person really is getting it right again and again as well.
Well, and that's a good question. How do errors like this affect our evaluation of the reliability of the big questions that we have? Did Jesus rise from the dead? Things like this.
It would depend on how many of them there were, and so I don't want to pretend like, oh, like it totally doesn't matter, right? This is why I think that it's so good to see how often harmonization actually works. What's called old-fashioned harmonization. You just say, no, John didn't get the day of Jesus' crucifixion wrong. You can put John together with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they're actually telling us the same day of Jesus' crucifixion. So I think it's good to see that just plain old-fashioned, like what Norman Geisler would have done, or Gleason, Archer, any of these guys, that works like virtually all the time. So it would matter if we had a ton of these. And it would matter more if they were deliberate. It doesn't have as big of an effect upon the big picture when they're non-deliberate. Again, because that's something we know how to expect. And there's a couple reasons for that. First of all, if a person is putting in deliberate changes, then he could also be making non-deliberate errors. So you've got you're doubling your number of ways in which he could be getting something wrong, or you could have something incorrect. So that's part of it, just an additional way that something could be wrong. But also, it's a lot less predictable. We can sort of predict how or what kinds of things people will get wrong and what kinds of things people will get right. Maybe not to the letter, but we have some idea of how that is. Whereas if it's something subjective, like I thought this would make a better story, how do I know what he thinks is going to make a better story? So that's going to have a much bigger effect even upon the big picture. So there are times when I will bring that in and I will say a minor good faith error is not going to have a big impact upon the reliability of the report of the incident as a whole. But I like to qualify that and be careful about that in terms of quantity and type and the fact that it's accidental rather than deliberate.
I've even heard it expressed that if there aren't these accidental conflicts, that might make it seem, or that might give us some reason to think it was fabricated. Does that seem right?
Well, that's a fascinating topic. In fact, I've got professional work out there about that very topic in probability theory, in the theory of knowledge. I've published on that. There's a great quotation from a guy named Starkey. He was a Christian writing back in the 19th century, and he said that he was quoting William Paley, who's even further back in the 1700s, and that the normal character of truthful witness testimony is substantial agreement with circumstantial variation and variety. So we definitely don't want things to be all exactly the same, and some kind of apparent discrepancies can be very useful in showing independence, and especially when we have all these literary theories of the Gospels that Matthew and Luke are just getting their stories from Mark in some cases, and then they're just adding stuff, and it's like, well, what if they appear to contradict Mark? Then they're probably not just getting the story from Mark, that kind of thing. On the other hand, I want to say that an apparent contradiction that can be harmonized is better, than one that can't be, because then you can have it all. You can have that appearance of independence because the author wouldn't deliberately put in even an apparent contradiction, but you can also have everybody telling the truth about everything because you've found that actually they are reconcilable. So reconcilable variation is actually a wonderful mark of truth. It's one of those older marks of truthfulness and marks of the reportage model that I like to bring out, and I mentioned the mirror or the mask.
That's great. So I think that's talking about undesigned coincidences, and you and your husband Tim and J. Warner Wallace and several others are kind of bringing this out. Uh, One of my favorite undesigned coincidences that I heard from you, I'm pretty sure, is with the feeding of the 5,000. And well, why did he ask Philip? Would you mind sharing sharing that with the audience?
Sure, yeah, that's one of my faves too. So Jesus sees the crowd coming toward him in the Gospel of John, and he looks at them coming, and we know from the synoptics that the disciples were already worried, how are they going to feed them, because it's getting toward the end of the day. So in John, he turns and he says to Philip, where shall we buy bread that these may eat? And so there's this kind of question like, why Philip? You could just say it's just chance. Hey, there's only 12 disciples to choose from. Philip was the one who happened to be standing there. But in the real world, if this really happened, there could be some reason, and we could be curious about why. Certainly, if the author's inventing, I would say he's unlikely to invent Philip. Philip's just not all that prominent. There's no special reason why Jesus should ask him that question. When we go elsewhere in the Gospel of John, not apropos of the feeding of the 5,000, completely different context, he mentions that Philip was from Bethsaida. Okay, how does that help? Well, then you go to Luke, completely separate gospel. He's telling about the feeding of the 5,000. He doesn't mention this dialogue with Philip. He doesn't mention that Philip's from Bethsaida, but he says the feeding took place near Bethsaida. So then you put it together, and it's like Jesus is saying, hey, Philip, where around here can we buy bread that these may eat? I talk about this and a lot more in my series, my YouTube series on the feeding of the 5,000. So you can look that up. I've got a playlist for the feeding of the 5,000. And the great thing about reconcilable variation is that it even goes beyond, I mean, undesigned coincidences are a type of that, but it even goes to apparent discrepancies that are reconcilable. So, for example, in that case, it says he's on the mountainside with his disciples and he sees the crowd coming. And he turns to Philip and says this. That's in John. Over in Mark, it says that the people had run ahead of him to try to kind of follow his boat. And it's only a few miles. They actually could do that. I mean, they like to walk back then, because he's trying to get away from the crowds, and they don't. It's like the paparazzi, they don't want to let him get away. And then it says he got out of the boat. He disembarked and he saw the crowd. So someone might say, and I used to wonder about this, is an apparent discrepancy. Did he see the crowd when he got out of the boat, or did he see the crowd when he was on the mountain? Because you don't get out of a boat on top of a mountain, right? So the Sea of Galilee, that's not going to be up on the top of the mountain, even though there are hills and mountains right in that region. But then you read in the Synoptic Gospels that he was with them that day, teaching and healing and so forth. And then the feeding takes place when it was evening. John skips all of that. He tells that he went over to the other side of the sea and he went up on a mountain with his disciples, but he doesn't tell you that he's been with the crowd all day. So what you realize is he's seeing the crowd on more than one occasion. And that's not just a kind of a desperate, oh, I'm an narratist, I've got to harmonize, but it actually makes sense. And the way I put it is it's more like a day at the fair or a conference or something than one single incident. The feeding of the 5,000 is this whole day long thing where he's mingling with the crowd, he's teaching them at different times. And then you can imagine he's getting tired and he and his disciples kind of slip away, up the hill.
Well,
And then the people...
and maybe that hinting, I'm getting tired. I need a break. Maybe that happened more than once.
Oh, yeah. And if you've ever been at a conference, you kind of know how this is. People are like, oh, there's Dr. Moreland, or oh, there's Dr. Craig, right? And like, they go over there, they got their books. Would you sign my book? That kind of thing. And so that's what's happening in the thing with Philip, where he says, he sees the crowd coming and says, where shall we buy bread that these may eat? So then there are actually two different times when he sees the crowd. And that's part of what I mean by reconcilable variation. It's pretty cool because it shows the independence, but it can be harmonized.
Okay. And so is that the same idea as trying to find it, unexplained illusions, or is that something slightly different?
It's slightly different. What I do say sometimes is that a unexplained illusion can be half of an undesigned coincidence. So if you have let me think of an even better example. Okay, here's another undesigned coincidence. At Jesus' trial before the Sanhedrin, they say, we heard him say he will destroy the temple and raise it up after 3 days. And that's just kind of weird. Like, why are they saying this against him? Like, what? Like, if they just wanted to get him in trouble, why would they say raise it up after 3 days? They might say he said he would destroy the temple, if they're just lying. So it looks like it's alluding to something else, but it's within Matthew and Mark, it's an unexplained allusion, because within those documents, we don't have the explanation. But then you go over to John, and in John 2, at the cleansing of the temple, they say, show us a sign of your authority to do this. And he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. So that's what's being alluded to in the in the trial. So undesigned coincidences and unexplained allusions are kind of connected, but then we have some unexplained allusions that we don't have the other side of. We don't know the explanation for, but that's a mark of truth also. So here's an example. There's a ton of them in John. I really like this hit. So here's one example of an unexplained allusion. Jesus says to the people at a certain point, I told you before that you've seen me and you have not believed on me. That's in John 6. And there's no place else in John where he tells them that. So it's like if John is just making up his words or he's putting words into his mouth, why would he make him say, I told you before, or I told you already? and have then no earlier time when he told them that, you know? Or here's another one in John. Jesus is speaking, he cries out on the great day of the feast, in the Feast of Tabernacles, if anyone is thirsty, um, let him come to me. And as the scripture says, from his innermost being, there will be a well of water, living water springing up. We have almost no idea what Old Testament scripture Jesus is talking about. I mean, it's almost a little embarrassing for Jesus to say, as the scripture says, and then we can't find the scripture. But the great thing about this is, like, why would John make that up? He would not make up this unexplained allusion to a scripture that we don't find anywhere else. He might as well make Jesus say something that's more explainable. If he even wants to refer to living water, maybe he could have Jesus talk about, Moses striking the rock or something. And that at least would be, as when Moses struck the rock and the water, living water came forward, I will give you living water. Like, he could make it clearer, but he doesn't do that. So then it looks historical, like he's just really recording something historically, because Jesus could say something cryptic. He could use scripture in a way that's hard to understand, or have some scripture in mind that we can't read his mind, but it's very unlikely John would make that up. So those are a couple of cool examples of unexplained allusions as evidence of truth.
That's very interesting. It makes a lot of sense too. Is there any other kind of positive evidence for the reportage model?
Yeah, there's several. So we've talked about reconcilable variation, undesigned coincidences, unexplained allusions. I like to talk about unified personalities. That's one of my favorites, and I have a section in The Mirror or the Mask that I really urge people to get hold of. I want to interrupt myself here and say The Mirror or the Mask has chapter summaries at the end of every chapter. So I'd love it if you'd read the whole book. That would be great. But the whole book is not going to appeal to everybody. There are going to be sections where people are going to say, I really do not want to read about Roman biography. That's not my thing. Or about Greek exercise books. That's not my thing. And that's absolutely fine. But I've got an index. There's a Kindle version, fully searchable electronically. And then each chapter has in a gray box, has a summary. So feel free. My ghost is not going to come and haunt you if you read some parts and not others. So feel free to go look for this part about Peter. I have a section on the personality of Peter. And I'm using the work of some 19th century authors there who've written about Peter, and then adding a few things of my own. But I love to bring back, Tim has really gotten me hooked on bringing back these old arguments, that have been forgotten. And this is one from personalities. So Peter, for example, he's so impulsive. And I'm sure we've all heard sermons about this, but people don't always bring out in those sermons that this has value for the reliability of the Gospels, because you find it in like totally different stories, some of them miraculous. So, for example, when he says, call me to walk toward you on the water. Now, this is found only in Matthew. And I wonder a little bit if it might be because Peter was embarrassed about the story and he didn't tell Mark. And then Matthew said, I'm going to tell that story about how Peter, couldn't walk in the water, and Jesus had to rescue him, But that's so Peter, he's like, me, pick me, it's like he's a kid. He's always got his hand up, and he loves Jesus, though. It's this very warm, kind of heartwarming personality he has. And then he can't do it. And he gets out there and he starts to sink, and Jesus has to grab him. What does that remind you of? Well, his denying Jesus, right? He said, even if everyone else denies you, I will never deny you. But I think it's way too subtle to imagine the different authors. And there's more stories, that show this personality. It's all across all four Gospels, but different stories. Way too much to imagine that the Gospel authors are sort of writing fanfic or something, and they're going, like we might, if you wrote a Star Trek takeoff, you'd go, okay, I'm going to try to make Mr. Spock be this way or whatever. They didn't have fiction like that back then, where somebody knew, and I think it's very hard to do. I pointed this out in a video recently. Even in modern fictional contexts, like a television show, I started watching the television show Monk a few years ago, and I was binge watching Monk. I liked the first season, and I didn't like any of the other seasons. And I think I got through about season 4 and I said, why am I doing this? He's like a different person. He doesn't seem like the same personality anymore and so forth. The first season he was more competent, even though he was weird and so forth, he was able to focus on the job. And then as they kept going, they made Monk more and more like his OCD was so weird that he was solving the cases by accident because he couldn't focus because his OCD was so bad. They changed him. Okay, so even in modern fictional contexts, we have trouble keeping the personality consistent. And yet here in the context of these documents, these gospels that present themselves as historical, we find consistent personalities. And that's true of Jesus too, that Jesus' personality is consistent across the gospels, but in varied stories. So that's another kind of evidence.
Well, that's really cool. And you mentioned the Feeding of the 5,000 and your series that you did on it, and I just want to plug that. That was a great series. I've watched most of it. Definitely recommend it. Now, I also hear that you have a new book coming out on John's Gospel that's coming out in the spring. That sounds really interesting. Would you tell us a bit about that? Maybe what it's going to be called? And
Yeah, it's the Eye of the Beholder is the title. And so obviously the beholder is John, the Eye of the Beholder. I'm very excited about it. It's hopefully, Lord willing, it will come out in March. That's our hope. I suppose it might be April, but that's our hope right now. I am indexing it right now, which is people think that you can just have a computer index your book, and you really can't. You kind of have to do it yourself. So thank God for electronic search, searchable PDF and so forth. So I'm working on that right now, and I have reviewers reading it right now too. So we're kind of doing those concurrently, and then we hope to get those final files uploaded, Lord willing, in February and get it out on the market in March. So this is a book. There's a lot of books on John, but what I'm really trying to do is I'm really trying to take on that special view of John. You remember earlier in our conversation, I mentioned how you'll get people, and Dr. Craig Evans, I mentioned before, he does this. He calls John a horse of another color altogether. Very explicit that, and I would say he takes sort of a literary device model, you might call it, of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So he's already got them changing some things. But then John, it's like, way out there. He even says that Jesus in John looks like an allegorical figure at times. It's like Jesus in John definitely does not look like an allegorical figure. So I'm taking on those kinds of things. And what's a little unusual about this book is that I'm focusing on arguments that distance John from history, where those arguments have convinced certain evangelical scholars. So like that's how I'm sort of picking my arguments to spend time on, because I find that people tend to think, well, if so and so is known as an evangelical scholar, if he's like out there defending the Gospels or the resurrection, maybe he's debating Bar Ehrman or something, then if he thinks this is a good argument, that the Gospel's not all that historical, there must be some really strong evidence, because I know he's a Christian. I know he's an evangelical. I know he defends the Bible. So he must have some, how can I disagree with this?
or even when you're talking to non-believers, they can say, "Hey, this Christian believes this, and a lot of Christians believe this. So clearly, it's not so certain as you're telling me it is."
Exactly. So there is this notion, and I think sometimes the only bias people know about is an anti-supernatural bias. So they'll say, well, Mr. So-and-so believes in or Dr. So-and-so believes in the resurrection. So he can't have an anti-supernatural bias. He believes in miracles. So then that's like the only bias they know about. But there are other biases. Not even if you believe in miracles, you could still have a bias against the reportage model, for example, or you could have a bias against harmonization, or you could have a bias against the Gospel of John, huge bias against the Gospel of John that people have out there. So that's sort of how I chose my arguments to refute against John. Another thing that's I think maybe a little unusual about this book is that I spend about 3 chapters on the issue of Jesus' way of talking in John. And there are different aspects of that. over these 3 chapters. That's been a big thing that's been used. Like, oh, Jesus talks so differently, allegedly, in John than he talks in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So I kind of wanted to lay that to rest. I wanted to spend so much time and care on that argument and consider it from all different angles that have influenced people. I also wanted to take vague statements and say, well, let's make these more precise. So if someone says, well, John puts Jesus' words into Johannine idiom, I'm like, okay, what exactly does that mean? Like, how far can we take that? Or would this be merely Johannine idiom? Would this be going farther than that, etc.? And to try to really, spell that out. So I'm really emphasizing that. That makes it unusual. And then in the positive section of the book, I'm bringing some of these things in that we've been talking, these kinds we've been talking about here. Reconcilable variation, undesigned coincidence. I have some new undesigned coincidences in there that haven't been published in other books. Unified personality. So I do the personality of Jesus for obvious reasons in the John book. Unexplained allusions, unnecessary details. I bring that in, in intense realism that you get from the specificity of the details. John is always throwing in like numbers. How far had they rowed when they in the storm, when they saw Jesus coming toward them, and that kind of thing. It adds a really major air of verisimilitude. Now, a liar can throw that in, but I think if someone's not even attempting to be historical or to be believed as historical, he's not going to put that in. So this definitely just throws aside the whole literary device thing. Well, they're not even trying to be, they don't even mean their readers to take them as historical, or it looks like a horse of another color altogether. It's like, no, John looks like really, really historical. One of the jokes I kind of make in the book, I try to get a little humor in occasionally, is that talking about Jesus, is he like an allegorical character? Because that's what Dr. Evans said. He said he looks like Lady Wisdom. So in Proverbs, you may remember wisdom cries in the streets and so forth. And Dr. Evans makes that analogy specifically. So I said, here's Jesus. He's saying, giving like the bread of life discourse. I'm the bread of life that came down from heaven. And the people say, don't we know like who his father and his mother are? What do you mean you came down from heaven? Like, we know who you are, because he's speaking in the synagogue in Capernaum, and that's not all that far from where he was born. And I said, it's funny, that never happens to Lady Wisdom. Like nobody ever says, we know who your father and mother are, and it never tells like what city she's in. It'll say at the crossing of the ways or whatever. So obviously, this does not appear, he does not appear like an allegorical character. He's a real guy talking in a real place, and the people are bringing up the names of his father and mother and kind of using it against him. So that's the kind of thing I'm doing in the book, and then just showing all this great positive evidence. Then the one other thing that I think will excite people, I hope they don't just buy the book for this, but it's in there. I have an appendix and it's a long appendix. I mean, it's like a booklet in itself on the authorship of the gospel. And specifically, there's this view that Dr. Richard Bauckham has, that it was written by a disciple. Like, Bauckham has this very conservative view of authorship in one sense. It was a disciple. His name was John. He was the beloved disciple. He was the one who was next to Jesus at dinner. But it wasn't John, the son of Zebedee. It was a different guy named John. That's his theory of John the elder, or the other John that he says wrote the book. And I didn't want that to sort of take over the book. I mean, in a way, it's a sort of a side issue, because the book could be very reliable and reportage and everything, even if it was written by this other John. But it's a popular view, and it can, to some extent, undermine some of the historicity, because, for example, Bauckham thinks that the author did not travel to Galilee with Jesus. So he thinks the Galilee sections came from someone else, because he thinks he's like he calls him non-itinerant. I call him stay at home, that he's kind of stayed in Jerusalem. So it does affect certain aspects of reportage and what kind of theories we imagine. So I really have a lot of original material, and I'm also doing things that other people have done, like Andreas Kostenberger has disagreed with Bauckham on this, Charles Hill, and so forth. So I talk about what they talk about, but I have some of my own arguments too, that the author was not just not this other John, but that he was the son of Zebedee specifically. So if you're interested in that topic, get the book and read the appendix.
I'm very interested. And would we say that John is the author of Revelation as well?
I think so, though I don't get into that very much.
Sure.
But here's an interesting thing that's relevant. So there was a guy named Dionysius, and if I can remember this correctly, I believe he was in the 200s. I think I got that right. In the 200s, and then Eusebius, the great church historian, in the 300s. The two of them did not think that the author of the Gospel of John was the author of Revelation. So that Dionysius and I believe it was Dionysius of Alexandria and Eusebius, they promoted this notion of this other John, but it was only for Revelation. Like, they both thought that John, the son of Zebedee, wrote the gospel. And so there's been some confusion about this. It's been kind of interesting because what the modern I don't know, call them the Bauchamites, the people who take that view of the authorship of the fourth gospel, what they're sort of doing is they're borrowing some of the arguments of Dionysius and Eusebius concerning the existence of this supposed other John, and they're applying them in a way that Dionysius and Eusebius did not apply them. They're applying them not just to the authorship of Revelation, but to the authorship of the gospel. And that even has created some confusion about, who said what, and, did this church father actually say that someone other than John, son of Zebedee, wrote the Gospel of John? Literally, we have no church father, literally no church father who denied that John, the son of Zebedee, wrote the book of John, the Gospel of John. And we have several who say that, that he did. So that's kind of interesting.
That sounds incredibly fascinating. I would definitely have to check it out. I'm looking forward to that. Is there anything else that you'd like to bring up before we close this?
No, I hope people will follow my content. Be sure to click the bell on my YouTube channel too, so you get notifications, and subscribe, and follow me on Facebook. And I'm doing all kinds of things now to try to get around the Facebook algorithms to make sure you get all of my content. I'm even taking advice right now about whether to start at a separate author page, like separate from my regular Facebook page altogether, trying to decide on that. So I really hope that people will get this content, because it's so useful in talking to agnostics and atheists. I also want to encourage people, don't feel overwhelmed by the quantity. What I often tell people is, grab one thing that you like. So sort of the way that Ryan said earlier about the feeding of the 5,000 undesigned coincidence about Philip. Get a couple of those in your back pocket, like ammo. I hope that analogy doesn't offend anyone, but internalize them to the point that you feel comfortable with them. And then when somebody says the Gospels are legend, or the Gospels are myth, some kind of a skeptic meme, or, oh, scholars say this about the Gospels, or whatever, have those ready to bring out. You don't have to remember it all. And then you can gradually add to your stock. I'm starting a video series on the virgin birth right now. So I hope people will be interested and excited about that for the Christmas season. And I'm standing on the shoulders of giants there, because other people have done even more work on the virgin birth than I have, but I'm trying to popularize it in this new mode as well. So, follow me for more.
Yeah, that's great. All right. Well, thank you for talking with us, Lydia. John ends by saying, and there are also many other things that Jesus did, which, if they were written one by one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. I look forward to learning more about what Jesus has done for us as we spend eternity with him.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
Excellent. Make sure to check her out, lydiamcgrew.com, or look her up on Facebook and YouTube. The links are in the description. She's just Lydia McGrew. You will find her. I'm Ryan Hebert, and more than anything, I want you to meet Jesus.